thanks for joining us at the virtual expo here. So Steve and I will run through a high-level overview of Alvarium. Also, there's a breakout session that I did in the main track that I talked through a little bit more on the kind of the business side and the reasoning behind Alvarium. So Steve will give you a little more detail technically, and then we'll also get into there's a demo that Trevor Kahn from Dell is doing that gets into the code a bit in some of the command lines of how this stuff works in actual practice. So so yeah, Alvarium is all about data confidence. How do we develop measurable confidence across networks, and scale into this notion of interconnected ecosystems in the broader scheme of things. So I actually worked on this at Dell with Steve, and then I'm now the VP of Ecosystem at Zeta. I sit on the board as the chair of LF Edge. Steve, I don't know if you want to do a quick intro.
Yep, Steve Todd, a fellow at Dell Technologies, working on at the office of the CTO on this cool technology.
Yep, very cool. Okay, so we'll dive in. Really briefly, again, this is talked about in more depth in that other session, and there's more online. But where we're headed with more and more data on networks, eventually we're going to get to this notion of ambient computing. I've said for a while, fixed is the new mobile. Compute everywhere. This notion of trust that's intrinsic to the data itself is critical. We're going to see more and more interconnected ecosystems throughout both public and private life, and new experiences driven by that, new business models. It's ultimately about how do you interconnect all of these different things, but trying to do this by building trust relationships one by one, it just isn't feasible, at a global scale. So the idea with Alvarium is how do you build that trust in a systematic way into the data itself, from starting from silicon and moving up. So as part of this, you have to disaggregate the trust. You can't have one person own it. It has to be across the broader landscape. We'll touch on, there's a lot of people think about, oh, it's distributed ledger. Well, that's part of it, but distributed ledger doesn't necessarily tell you if the data is real. It just tells you, where it's been through smart contracts and whatnot. So it's a key component, but Steve will elaborate on how it's much more than one technology. So to that point, it really is a combination of technologies put together in a system level way. And Alvarium is about building the framework that binds together these loosely coupled trust insertion technologies and drives measurable confidence through an embedded algorithm. So what we've done is we've started Project Alvarium within LF Edge, and LF Edge is an umbrella of projects similar to Cloud Native Compute Foundation and LF Networking, complementary, working towards how do we harmonize these different projects. And the whole idea with Alvarium is to bring these different trust insertion technologies together, both within LF Edge and externally. It's a horizontal solution, but we want to make sure we, of course, apply it to real world use cases. Steve will talk a little bit more about the history that Dell Technologies is seeding the code, and had a lot of contributions from the IOTA Foundation over the past few years, and when working with Intel, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And there's a number of other companies that are involved, and it really is about creating that core framework, the related APIs that bind together different ingredients that you might want to build a trust fabric with, and then those algorithms. And the goal of Alvarium is to not only do that, but also build those bridges to other complementary projects. With that, Steve, I'll hand it off to you if you want to kind of dive in a little bit more on the technology itself.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. I think if we want to talk about the two elements of the project mission, number one, what's a framework for contributing annotations? And then number two, how do we score? What are the algorithms? It would be really helpful to kind of put together a flow of data across an edge ecosystem. So if you could go to the next slide, what we see here is just on the left, we see a variety of different sensors, and the flow of data in this slide is basically left to right. And when we talk about trust insertion technologies, we're basically saying that there is a large number of technologies from dozens, if not hundreds of different vendors that add some sort of trust characteristics to the data as it flows from left to right. So if you look at the categories at the top, right, you might have hardware root of trust signatures on the data as it originates from a sensor or as it's ingested by a gateway. You may have some type of secure operating system. Perhaps it has a trusted platform module that can tell you that a secure boot happened. You may have open data ingestion software from EdgeX Foundry, right, where the ingestion is transparent, right? You know what's going on as the data is being ingested because it's open source software. You may have privacy preserving silicon, like trusted execution environments in the data path. You can attach trusted metadata, such as where did this data originate? Who's the owner? What policies are associated with it? Moving forward, you may decide to store this close to the sensor in a scale-out object store that's immutable and tamper resistant. And then finally, you may register that data as it flows from left to right. So the idea here is, if you consider all of the different vendors that have trust insertion technologies that can really take care of the data from its birth through its transfer and delivery to an application, how can Alvarium create a framework that all those vendors can plug into that allow us to annotate that these things are happening and then create a score based on how much trust is being inserted? So we decided to test this theory with some partners. And on the next slide, you'll see an example of a ledger. And what happens, again, we've got that left to right flow down the bottom. We've got a sensor generating a bit stream. And in this example, as it arrives at the gateway, there's 3 trust insertion technologies present. You're able to validate the signature on the data. You're able to attest that the gateway went through a secure boot process. And you're able to authenticate any authentication software is running on that gateway that prevents unauthorized people from looking at it. So the fact that all 3 of these trust insertion technologies were present on the gateway allows us to annotate that it happened and assign a score of 1. In this case, 1 means the trust insertion technology executed successfully. 0 means it did not. Right? And so as the data moves from left to right, the annotations and the scores similarly move like a sidecar that accompanies the data. And the beauty of this is by the time you get to an application, you can actually have that application not only analyze the bit stream, but consult a trusted ledger to tell you what is the score of that data. And how did you calculate the score? What trust insertion annotations contributed to the technology? So given this idea of how can we measure data confidence, we decided to try and partner with a couple of vendors outside of Dell to determine whether or not this was feasible. And so we partnered with Intel and IOTA. And we talked about, well, what happens if our gateway has TPM capability from Intel? And what if happens if our edge server has a trusted execution environment, such as Intel SGX? Well, privacy can be preserved when an analytic algorithm is running on an edge server, for example. So we simulated the movement of data across these different types of trust insertion technologies. So now we're measuring trust all the way down to the silicon. And as the data moved across a gateway, across the edge server, and into a trusted storage system, the ledger annotations ended up being nodes in IOTA's Tangle technology. So IOTA's Tangle technology is another form of distributed ledger that's implemented as a directed acyclic graph as opposed to a blockchain data structure. So we actually did a webinar with Intel and IOTA that showed this edge simulation and actually showed that these 5 annotations, as they are applied consecutively, increase the score from a 2 to a 4 to a 6 to an 8 to a perfect 10. So we actually, once we demonstrated that this idea does work, that's when we decided to approach the Linux Foundation and work with the LF Edge team on drawing more customers into this conversation. If you'd like a little bit more information about the privacy preserving edge vision that Intel has, you can go to the next slide, Jason. We published a white paper that introduced in detail the idea of a data confidence fabric and talked about the history of Dell EMC and Intel working together in a data center to create trusted data paths and how that idea can be extended out onto the edge via this technology called a data confidence fabric, where different vendors with different trust insertion technologies are working together to annotate that data and create a confidence score. So next slide, Jason, basically highlights what are the next steps? How can you join us in Project Alvarium? Well, the stream that I'm working on with Trevor Kahn from Dell is to basically introduce this architecture and take a look at the code base and start to vet that the API does indeed satisfy the use cases for different verticals. It validates that all the vendors who are bringing trust insertion technology to the table have a good API. We're porting our API from the Golang into Java with other targeted languages such as C and perhaps Python. And once we get a wide variety of languages supported and we start to get annotations and exercise the data confidence fabric ingestion point, the next step would be to work together as an industry and develop these confidence scoring algorithms. So join us if you're interested in learning the nuts and bolts of data confidence fabrics. And Jason, perhaps you can say a little bit about where we're going next from an ecosystem perspective.
Yeah. So in parallel to the architecture and the core technical work, we will be doing ecosystem outreach. I'm helping to lead that effort among others. And the notion here is attaching this obviously to meaningful use cases. Energy seems like a initial place that we're going to anchor on. There's a variety of industry efforts that we're looking to augment with these concepts. But of course, this applies across the board. If you watch the video that's at alvarium.org, it kind of walks through the concept in more detail. There's some mock UIs in there, and it shows how like a smart city can start to bleed over into the home, and then the retail equation over into the home, and then of course supply chains and the energy ecosystem. And as I said, everything becomes interconnected over time, but you need these common foundational elements. And so that's the key with the ecosystem outreach, is to start tying those things together with the technology, and then also bring in other communities and whatnot that are building solutions for trust. And Alvarium's differentiated in the fact that it's system level. It goes down to silicon and has the various different layers of trust insertion, but there's also a lot of really good efforts that are focused on kind of data models and smart contracts and things like that we want to collaborate with versus reinvent. So yeah, definitely check out the video at alvarium.org. At the website, there's information about how to get involved. You can go to get the code on the GitHub. Definitely within this expo here, there's the other video that you can click on where Trevor is going to show some of the code running and your command interface, showing how annotations are happening and how it gets registered to a ledger. So certainly welcome you to get involved, and you reach out to us if you want to learn more in general. And I think this is like a super important topic for the long term of how do we not only scale new business models, but also combat things like AI automation and fake data, and deal with compliance things like GDPR, and we've got to build the trust into the data itself. Steve, any closing thoughts from you?
That's it from my end, Jason. Looking forward to working cross vendors, cross industry to solve this tough problem of trust on the edge.
Yeah, great. All right, thank you.